In a boy with ADHD, it's ramped up. But when they're young, when they're in kindergarten, first, second grade, it's really hard to tell the difference because a lot of boys have a lot of hyperness. If you think that being a parent is the greatest and most important job you're ever going to do, but you also fully understand that it's filled with challenges and headaches too, you're in the right place. Welcome to the Dad's All In podcast. What is going on, everybody? Welcome to the Dad's All In show. Tonight we are talking about our boys, our sons. They got a lot of juice. They've got a lot of energy. And how do you know if your son is just an active boy, which the majority of boys are, or if maybe you should have some concerns about ADHD? We are going to dive into that today. I'm going to share some information with you about boys in general and how parts of their brain develop a little slower, which makes them a little more aggressive and active. But it also dives into an ADHD brain and what that looks like. And so by the end of this show tonight, my hope is for you to have an idea of whether your son might have some characteristics of ADHD, or maybe your son is just a regular boy who is active and has a lot of juice and a lot of energy in the tank, like many of them do. So let's dive into why I'm diving into this kind of content about boys. It came from an email I got from Lisa from Sioux Falls. Let me read this out to you quick. So it says, "Hey Dad, my 5 and 7-year-old sons have always had a ton of energy and impulsivity. Is this going to slow down and get better anytime soon? And is there anything I can do to speed up that growth? I love them and all, but good God, they are nonstop. Please send help. Thanks for all you do for families." Lisa from Sioux Falls. So, all right, here's the thing. Boys have a lot of juice. And when we're thinking about how to best help them, I always want to go back to this important piece. And if you've been a long-time listener, you've heard me say this many times about a lot of different topics. Everybody's got their own unique brain. So it doesn't matter if you have ADHD or if you're what we call neurotypical, you have just a typical brain. It doesn't matter. Everybody still has their own unique brain. ADHD is an umbrella, and it has kids that have moderate and mild symptoms to kids that have significant symptoms. If a child has significant symptoms, it's a little bit easier to figure out whether they have ADHD or not. If it's moderate to mild, it can be more difficult, and it gets easier maybe to identify that as your child gets older, and we'll talk about that. But before I dive into like ADHD, I want to talk about boys in particular and just the general boy brain, some things that you need to know, okay? So besides the fact that, yes, they've all got their own unique brain, no two brains are alike, there are some things about the boy brain that are important. And it's the reason why your son has so much energy and impulsivity and maybe lacks self-control. It has to do with the prefrontal cortex of your brain. It doesn't develop as quickly as, we'll say, females. That particular portion of your brain actually has a lot of different important functions. And to no surprise, it goes along with exactly what we're talking about. It affects self-control. It can lead to more movement, meaning like your son might need more movement because of the lack of prefrontal cortex development. It also dives into physical activity, in that we're talking about aggressiveness. Boys a lot of the times will want to wrestle, or they'll want to have like a physical contest. It doesn't mean they want to hurt each other. It's kind of how boys communicate. It sounds odd, especially I've shared this with females, with mothers. I've shared this with female teachers before, and it sounds odd to say that boys sometimes want to communicate through aggressive play, but it's absolutely true. One of my all-time heroes is Dr. Michael Gurian. Actually, I've shared this before in my podcast. One of my highlights of my podcasting career goes back to one of maybe my second year into my educators podcast that I used to have. I had Dr. Michael Gurian on to talk about, he does a lot of research with brains and how a male brain can be different from a female brain. And he coined this term specifically towards aggression. Okay, he calls it aggression nurturance, which is sounds odd to have those two things together, aggression and nurturance, but really it's almost like, I don't know you, I'll introduce myself would be a great way to do this, but instead, how about we wrestle? And we don't have to communicate, we'll just wrestle. And that means that's a sign of me saying, I'm good with you, you're good with me. So as odd as that sounds, that is a portion that comes from a portion of your brain in the prefrontal cortex that wants your boys to be a little more aggressive. And then the other thing, it just high levels of physical play and physical activity. So yes, that's why we say, for boys, a lot of times getting them involved in sports is a great thing. They get to be able to kind of work through all of that, and eventually, with good people around them, they start to understand the boundaries. And I say that because boys in particular, when we're talking about how they figure out what to do, it's because they hit a boundary. And by a boundary, I mean, yes, maybe it's a physical boundary. You've got a boy who's got a lot of juice and they're just running around like crazy and they hit a wall. Bang. That's a physical boundary. That's taught them a lesson. Oh, I've got to make sure that I've got my eyes open while I'm running around, or I'm going to hit a wall, for example. The other part of that is you as the parent or any adult that's working with kids, helping them understand boundaries. It is important, and I'm not diving into like behavioral stuff. It's important to build your son up, let him know when he's making good choices, reinforcing it with positive praise. But the other side of that is he needs to know when he's made a poor choice or when he's done something incorrectly, and you're going to guide him through that process, whether it be setting consequences, or maybe it's just having a discussion with him about, hey, that's not appropriate. So boys do need consequences. Also, they just need boundaries in general. And without them, they're going to keep pushing the limits. That's actually what we would call human development. The idea of you as a parent helping them understand the boundaries so that your boy will be able to develop in a way that they learn over time. So that is just in general the boy brain, which can be a complex thing. As a former elementary school teacher, I had a lot of recess time where I'd be outside with the kids and I'd be talking with a fellow teacher, elementary school. Most of the time, my colleagues that I worked with, their staff members, were female. And there was a lot of times when boys would do some things and whoever I was working with, she would turn to me and go, my goodness, they look like wild animals. I'm like, yeah, they're having fun as long as we got to make sure that they're not throwing each other around, obviously, because it's school. But they're having fun. It's kind of an odd way to communicate, but that's kind of what they're doing. They're letting each other know that, hey, they're good with each other. In the classroom is a different beast, because now we're asking kids, and I'm focusing most of this conversation on the elementary years, but ADHD can be identified well before kindergarten. It can certainly be identified after elementary school, which was the case of my son. Although my wife and I had some inklings. My son has ADHD. My daughter has ADHD, and they come by it honestly because so do I. And it is interesting how it looks different in all of us. I can see certain characteristics of my ADHD brain in my kids, but we all have our own unique, just our unique characteristics about it. So I say all of that because a lot of the times, boys in general, they have these behaviors. And in elementary school, it doesn't always come through easily, even for boys who don't have ADHD. There are plenty of 5 and 6-year-olds that have a hard time just sitting. And so elementary schools sometimes are not set up well enough for boys, meaning it's not designed specifically for a boy brain, because if it was, they'd find a whole lot more ways to have movement and discovery learning, exploratory learning. Now, that's not to say there aren't classrooms out there that do that. There absolutely are. There are a ton of amazing teachers who get this concept. It's just good learning in general. Obviously, I've got an education background, And now as a professor, this is the kind of things that I share with my students as they're getting ready to become teachers, is that you need kids to be exploring and learning and part of the process. It's just good brain development, whether you're a male or female. It doesn't really matter. But for boys in particular, when we're talking about elementary school, the more movement we have in the classroom, the more work we can on building their behaviors and helping them establish boundaries, the more successful they're going to have, the more success they're going to have. So let's talk a little bit. So that's a bit about boy brain. Let's talk a little bit about the ADHD brain. So in the ADHD brain, I want you to understand again, no brain's the same. They're all unique, but general characteristics of ADHD. The first things that pop off, everybody's going to say, well, hyperness, yes. Impulsivity, yes. Inattentiveness, yes. So let's start there, and then I'll give you a couple others. Hyperness, well, that kind of goes without saying. You have a son that is just juiced. This was me as a kid, and it still is in some ways now, although as you get older, you find ways to cope and work through your challenges a little bit more. For me now, even as I sit here, I'm talking to you, you can't see this, but my foot is moving, right? That allows me to focus. And if I was in a classroom, taking a class, as a student, I would be moving my foot too, because it allowed me to focus on whatever we're doing. It could also help me with like relieving anxiety, because another characteristic of ADHD is not talked about enough. I'm not diving into a lot today, but it is absolutely one, is anxiety. So those two go hand in hand. That's not necessarily something I usually struggle with, but there are a lot of kids who have ADHD and anxiety. Those two go hand in hand for a lot. So the hyperness is, again, goes back to prefrontal cortex. In a boy with ADHD, it's ramped up. But when they're young, when they're in kindergarten, first, second grade, it's really hard to tell the difference because a lot of boys have a lot of hyperness. They've got a lot of juice in them. They got a lot of positive energy and just energy. Maybe it's not always positive, but a lot of it is. The impulsivity part is basically things pop into their brain and they come up with ideas that are like, let's give that a go, without truly thinking it through. Meaning, will this be safe? Is this a good idea? Is this something I should do? Those thoughts don't go through the brain of a young kid with ADHD because those portions of the brain aren't developed yet. And as somebody who definitely had and still does impulse challenges, now I've obviously come a long way, but when I was a kid, I had a ton of impulse challenges. And some things would pop into my brain. I'd be like, yeah, what a great idea. Or some of my friends would be like, hey, what about this? And what you realize is your friends start to pick up on the idea that you're willing to do things that are a little bit out of the ordinary. And maybe they start to prod you along too, to try to get you to do stuff. And your impulsivity portion of your brain is like, yeah, why not? Yeah, impulsivity is definitely a big part of ADHD. And inattentiveness is the first thing that most people think about when they talk about ADHD. Now, traditionally, we've also had ADD, doesn't have the H, doesn't have the hyperness. We categorize them all under ADHD and the umbrella now, because what we do know now is that even those with ADD still have the hyperness, but it's internal instead of external. So the brain is constantly firing. My daughter would be a good example of this. And so would my son. They both have this. And so the brain is constantly firing, but in some cases you don't notice, meaning you can't visibly see it from the outside. So inattentiveness is not necessarily that they can't focus on things. It's actually the opposite for a lot of kids with ADHD. It can be they focus on everything, which makes it hard to do one thing. And so the example I will give to you is one of the reasons why growing up, I was like the only human in the world, or at least I felt this way, who hated open book tests. Because you know what happened during open book tests? Everybody is turning pages and things are moving, and I couldn't focus. I had a hard time focusing on one thing in the first place, but my senses were like on fire during those kinds of tests because everybody's doing stuff and I'm focusing more on all the things that are happening around me. And so that is one example of how inattentiveness is actually can be because you focus on a lot of different things, which makes it hard to focus on one thing. This is a challenge for a lot of kids. And there are different levels in all of these characteristics that I share with you today. Some of them are mild, some of them are significant. If your child has a significant symptom in inattentiveness, it is really challenging for them to get through and to do things. I'm not diving into today like accommodations for schools and things like that. However, if that's something you want me to get into, those are things I can talk about in future shows, future podcasts, even videos that I put out on YouTube. So let me know in the comments. Let me know if that's the kind of thing you're looking for. If you're curious about what are some things that can help your child with ADHD in school. Not only did I live it myself, I have 2 kids who have 504 plans for a variety of reasons, but each of them, one of the reasons is ADHD, along with some other disability types that they're working through. The next thing I'm going to tell you is an odd one for most people. As I said, and it's going to sound like a contradiction, as I said, with an ADHD brain, you focus on everything. However, there is a superpower hidden in many people with ADHD, myself included. This is probably the number one reason why I all of a sudden went to college and was successful. It's hyperfocus, meaning that as hard as it might be to focus on something, if it's something you're into, something you enjoy, you can lock in and go for hours and like the world will crumble around you and you won't even notice it. That sounds amazing for people who want to get stuff done. It's why there's a lot of successful people with ADHD, by the way. They've figured out this portion of their brain. If you don't know my background, I had some behavior challenges. I definitely had some academic challenges. And when I went to college, I was more successful than I was in high school, definitely than I was in middle school. Number one reason, I started to realize how my brain ticked. And I could kind of trick my brain, and I still do this now. Even, when I'm doing work for content creation or I'm doing stuff for my job as a professor, maybe I'm grading papers, whatever, I will tell myself, okay, I'm just going to do a little and try and just kind of get started on something, even if I don't enjoy it. And then the next thing you know, 2 hours later, I've been grinding hard. Like there's a switch in my brain. This isn't everybody, but in my brain, there's a switch up there that unlocks once I start something. And I just go in, like my full focus goes hard into it. And so that is the good side of it. But the harder side for a lot of kids is pulling away from what you're doing, which leads me into the next part, because a lot of kids with ADHD have a hard time transitioning away from their whatever they're hyper focusing on. If you're not sure what I mean by hyper focus, if your kid enjoys video games and they don't pull away, that's exactly what I'm talking about. A lot of children, boys, girls, don't want to pull away from video games. But you've got a son who is locked in on video games and they've got ADHD that has hyper focus challenges. Whew, yeah, they might set the world on fire when you try to pull them away. Which leads me into my next characteristic. And really the last one I'm going to share. There's a lot more than what I'm sharing with you today, but these are the kind of like the 5 main that I'm going to focus on to start with. And then I'm going to get into how you can tell the difference between a boy with ADHD versus a typical what we call neurotypical boy brain. Emotional regulation is what is in your brain that says, okay, let's talk ourselves through this. Let's self-talk. Let's calm ourselves down. Let's understand we can't keep video gaming for hours. I've now got to go eat dinner with my family. That's emotional regulation. A lot of boys, just a lot of kids in general with ADHD struggle with emotional regulation. And that can sometimes look, well, for a lack of better terminology, emotional. It could be tears, but it could also be much more significant than just crying or maybe getting sad. It could be anger, frustration, aggressiveness, all those things, because they're having a hard time regulating their emotions. And that is definitely another big component of ADHD that kids will struggle with. boys in particular, but kids with ADHD brains, if they're struggling with emotional regulation, that is a challenge. And again, that's not you may be listening to this and you're like, I've got a kid with ADHD and they don't have some of these characteristics. That's okay. And remember, every brain's different. And like I said, in my house, for example, I have ADHD, my daughter, my son, it all presents itself differently. I've worked with tons of kids with ADHD through the years, tons. It looks a little different in everybody. And that's kind of the piece that when I'm working with anybody on how to figure out the best path forward for their child with ADHD, is we look at that individual child, what their individual brain makeup is, and what the accommodations are that are going to help them. What are the supports? What are the ways that we can get them on the right track so that they understand, hey, you do some things great. Let's keep doing that. And then here's some things to work on. And here's some things that are going to help you have more success. We're not getting into that today. But again, if that's something you're interested in, let me know in the comments. And I'll be sure to put something together. We could dive into that on another live show even. All right. So we talked about the boy brain. We talked about an ADHD brain. How do you know if your son has ADHD or if they're just an active boy, like so many of them are? Here's a couple things I want you to think about. Number one, the consistency of the characteristic. For example, if you've noticed your son has a lot of juice, a lot of energy, how hyper are they? Are they going hard for 10 minutes and then coming down? Or are they just going hard? Like they're juiced for a long period of time. That in itself is not a complete diagnosis. I'm not helping you diagnose your son today here, by the way. I'm just giving you some things to think about. So how consistent is whatever behavior? If we're talking about an inability to really focus and get things done. Another thing that we didn't touch on, but is definitely a characteristic of it, ADHD, is executive functioning, or all those organizing skills. But you know what? A lot of kids struggle with organizing skills. But if you see it consistently over long periods of time, that's a concern. It's something to keep tabs on. Along with the consistency is the next part. Are you seeing it not just at home? Is it being seen at school? Is it being seen in their extracurricular activities? ADHD isn't something that just hides. Even in those that have ADHD internally in their brain, it's not hidden. It's always there. You can do things to work through it, accommodate yourself essentially, but it's still going to be prevalent. So, for example, your son, if they're struggling with a lack of focus on getting things done in the house, whatever it is, then they go to school and you're hearing the same message from their teacher. Then they go to soccer practice and you're seeing it in soccer practice. They're not listening to directions. They're doing their own thing. Even when the coach tries to redirect them, they're not dialing it in. All those things you're kind of seeing over multiple environments. That's another signal maybe this is something to think about. Then I will also say along those lines, what's the intensity of the behavior? It's one thing if your child's a little bit inattentive, because all boys are going to be inattentive at some point. That's just part of being a boy. It's human development, right? Most people can't hold their attention for an hour on everything straight. Most people don't have that ability. So, but if your son is struggling with inattentiveness, but it's really intense, meaning they can only focus on something for 30 seconds or they can only focus it on for a minute, that's something as a signal to keep an eye on. Again, I'm not necessarily talking about the things they love. Take the top 2 or 3 things that they love. If they can sit down and video game for hours, kind of throw that one off the table because they might have the ability to hyper-focus. And then leads me to this last piece, and this is where it all comes together. Age is an important piece to the puzzle because we've talked about how consistent is the behavior, how is it across multiple environments, and what's the intensity. But the actual age of your son plays a significant role. For example, if your son is impulsive and they're 4, welcome to being a 4-year-old. I've got a block. I'm going to throw a block and I'm going to throw it into the wall. You know why? Seems like a good idea. It's because the majority of boys at 4 years old have not developed that portion of their brain. However, if your 12-year-old has a block in their hand and if you give it to them, they're going to fling it into the wall or do something else impulsive. And I don't mean like once a month and once in a blue moon. I'm talking about these are impulsive things you're seeing consistently in multiple environments. As they get older, it is, I'm never going to say it's easy to diagnose, figure out if someone has ADHD, although if it's significant, some may say it is. As it gets older, it is a little bit easier to identify. Here are the characteristics, I can see it. And the reason is when you start comparing to other kids their age, as they get older, there starts to be a gap in behavior. And by behavior, I'm not saying good behavior and bad behavior. I'm saying like attention to tasks, how jacked up and juiced they are, all those kinds of behaviors. Another example would be this. You have a 5-year-old that has a hard time sitting in a chair in elementary school. Again, welcome to kindergarten. Boys in particular, you walk into a kindergarten class, they have a hard time sitting for a long period of time. You walk into a 4th grade class and your son has a hard time sitting for, I don't want to say like hours, I'm talking about, maybe 10 or 15 minutes, they have a hard time sitting. That's another signal. You see that at home, like they have a hard time just sitting at the dinner table with you. When they're 10, that's a little bit more of a signal than when they're 4. So the age component is a big piece. I'll give you this quick story. I've had a lot of kids with ADHD that I worked with. The one thing I will always go back to is there were some students that I had, because I moved grade levels occasionally, that I had in multiple years. And when I had a student in, let's say, 2nd grade, and I had a conversation with the parent about, I want you to know, here's some things that I'm seeing about your son. He's having a hard time focusing and getting his work done. He's really struggling to organize his stuff. Again, at that point, I'm like, well, welcome to being a 2nd grader. It's kind of what everybody does. He's got a lot of juice. He's pretty hyper. I'm kind of going through those things. The next thing is, for the parent, it's like a trigger, like, let's keep an eye on this. You hear that same message in 3rd grade, maybe again in 4th grade. Now like, maybe there's something here. And I say that because I had actual examples of students I had in 2nd grade, and then I had them again a couple years later, and the same symptoms. And I shared with the parents, it's been a couple years. As an educator, by the way, teachers cannot tell you your child has ADHD. Like, that's not something they should be allowed to, nor can they tell you that. They're not psychologists. They can't diagnose. But what they can tell you is what they see in the classroom. They shouldn't even be able to say, hey, your son has characteristics of ADHD. Instead, they're going to say, here's what we're seeing in the classroom. Johnny is fill in the blank. And that is a sign for you to maybe push forward to see if you can get an evaluation. By an evaluation, I'm talking about a psychologist, more than likely, sitting down and doing a variety of different tests. By tests, I'm not talking like, it doesn't necessarily have to be, how you evaluate for ADHD doesn't have to be like, hey, what's your ability in reading and math? And that's not exactly what I'm getting at. It's kind of like checklists of things for you to fill out, the teachers to fill out, and then they gather some information. That's really what they're doing. And they're looking, again, across multiple environments, what's the consistency of things, and they're diving into those kinds of pieces. So that being said, if you go the route of getting an evaluation, which probably would start with your family physician, and they would refer you to somebody. In most cases, that's how it works. In some cases, schools may work with you because they have a psychologist, and every state operates a little bit differently. So that's a possibility as well. At any rate, an evaluation will give you a breakdown of what your son is doing well, what your son needs to improve on. And my message for you is this. You're going to find out either, yes, my son was diagnosed with ADHD, or no, he was not. If he is, it's not the end of the world. It's hard to find out that your kid has any kind of condition, medical condition, disability, allergies, anything that's out of the ordinary. It's hard for parents to go through that. Believe me, my wife and I know we've got kids with medical needs, neurodivergent needs. social, emotional, mental health, pretty much the gamut in our family. We've gone through a lot. We've been through a lot. That's kind of our family story. So I get it. But what I'm here to tell you is, as a proud ADHDer, it's not the end of the world. Your child has some superhuman strengths in them. It is getting them to understand what those are and then being able to help them figure out strategies for the things they need to keep working on. And that's the purpose of the evaluation. It will allow your son to be able to, you to get the knowledge, and your son to be able to have supports at school or even outside of school if it will help him. So, recap. How do you know if your son has ADHD versus are they just being an active boy like many, many neurotypical boys are? It's not just the behavior, but it's the consistency of it. It is, do you see it across multiple environments? And what's the intensity of that behavior? And maybe the most important piece, what's the age that goes along with it? Okay? So keep those things in mind. When all else fails, talk with your family physician, talk with the school, collaborate together, figure it out together so that your son gets the best of whatever it is that he needs to be successful. Thank you so much for checking out our show tonight. I appreciate you hanging out with me. Remember, next week, we're talking about insurance because you deserve a break financially. And so we're having my good friend come on and talk about ways to save you and your family money heading into the rest of 2026. And believe me, I believe families need all the breaks they can get financially. Thanks so much for listening. Appreciate you. If you're new, thanks for stopping in. Please subscribe, like. If you're on audio, shout out to my audio podcast listeners. Please follow, rate, review, all the things. Have a great week, everybody. We'll see you again next week. Thanks for listening to the show. Be sure to follow me at Dad's All In Podcast on all the socials. You can also email me with any questions that you'd like answered on future shows or just to provide me with feedback or ideas. Feel free to reach out to my email, dadsallinpodcast@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. Have a great one, my friend.